Welcome to A Little More History with Mrs. Moore. Hi, everybody. This is Mrs. Moore. Welcome back to A Little More History. Today we're going to pick up where we left off, and we had been talking about what happens when man begins to become what's known as Homo sapien, begins to be thinking, begins to understand the world around him, manipulates tools, and all of this leads to what we call the Neolithic Revolution. Now, when we talk about a revolution, we're talking about not just an armed conflict, but a revolution, as we discussed in class, is really a radical change of life. When we look at what happened in March and April and May of this year, we could say that there was a COVID revolution because life changed radically. We weren't going out to restaurants. We weren't in school. We weren't going to football and baseball games. Radical changes happen in our lives. The same thing happens during that Neolithic age when man begins to use more complex tools, begins to solve more problems. And as he's solving more and more problems, his life is changing forever. So today we're going to look at the before and the after of the Neolithic Revolution. And we're going to talk a little bit about what this revolution looked like. Okay, so why do we learn about this Neolithic Revolution? Well, one big reason is because the world we live in today is directly related to the advances that we made in that Neolithic Revolution. Some of the things that we do today are directly related to this revolution, from our forms of government that we live under, the types of work that we do, how we trade for food and goods. All of these things really began way back in this Neolithic Revolution when man switched to living a more sedentary lifestyle. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So just to review where we've come from, remember humans began to control nature in the Stone Age. At first, humans faced a great struggle for survival. They didn't have sophisticated tools, and they were primarily concerned with finding food and staying alive. Can they find shelter that would keep them warm throughout the winter? Would they have enough food to be able to survive? These are things that man needed to solve as problems, and he was able to do this by developing fire, by building shelters, by making tools and clothing. All of these things evolved over time. These are things that man learned how to do. One step led to another. And these early Stone Age men and women began to be called hunter-gatherers. Now, a hunter-gatherer family, we see it over here in the left, a lovely little family with a dinosaur for a pet that, well, actually it looks like dinosaurs for food. The families were nomadic. In a hunter-gatherer family, you were moving to follow the herds or to follow the growing seasons so that you would have enough food to last. So if you knew that the antelope were in one particular part of the country in the spring, you would move to that particular hunting ground. You would get as much meat as you needed, and then you might follow that herd as it moved off to another spot to spend the summer or the fall. Now, there were specific gender roles that were assigned. The men were primarily the hunters. They assumed the greatest risk because they were the physically strongest people there. Now, does that mean that there weren't any women who were hunters? Perhaps there were. Perhaps there were some very strong women who would be hunters, but for the most part, guys hunted and women gathered. And when we say gathered, they're looking for berries. They're looking for tubers like potatoes in the ground, things that are growing wild, and they're gathering those fruits, those vegetables, those herbs, and they're bringing them back to their settlement to add to the meat that their husbands would hunt. It was also easier for women who were assigned the role of taking care of the children to gather where it was safe as opposed to bring their children on a hunt. Now, these same small groups would often return to the same areas during the same seasons year after year. So you got to a point where you realized, the antelope really like this watering hole. We're going to hang out over here in the spring. But in the summer, they really like that forest over there. So we're going to hang out in that forest. So they established camps in the same places every year as they migrated with the herds. But over time, humans began to realize that they could leave seeds in one area one year and find plants growing there the next year. Now, and a lot of this happened out on garbage heaps. They would eat, let's say they would eat a whole bunch of sunflowers, they would throw some of the stuff away, and then they'd move to the next camp, but they'd come back the next year, and the plants would be growing where they had dumped those seeds, that waste. Well, they began to recognize that maybe there's something to this. If we plant a seed, maybe the same crop will grow. So, this domestication or this taming of plants and animals begins a whole new era of human life. Instead of having to move to find food, they could stay in one place and farm and have food readily available to them. So man begins to domesticate not only plants, but he begins to domesticate animals as well. So the first animals that were tamed were dogs. Dogs and men have grown up together almost. It just seemed like there's this natural connection between the two. But after dogs came goats and cows and sheep. And so what man did is he began to feed these sheep. The sheep would then come back day after day because here was a ready supply of food. And eventually, the man would then build a pen, a place where these sheep could be kept. Or he would begin to have sheep that were his, and he would have a dog who would be a herding dog who would take care of these sheep and cows and herd them and keep them together. So man uses these goats and these cows and these sheep, these pigs, as a source of protein, of meat, and he grows wheat and corn and barley from these plants that he is beginning to domesticate. So now, instead of having to move from place to place, he can settle in one place. He can rely on the food that he is domesticating. The plants are coming in. He's always got goats and sheep. He's able to have his meat. And all of this now is creating a surplus. He can store things. He has extra. And this idea of having extra, of having a surplus, enables him to begin to transform his way of life from living in the wild to now living in communities where people shared their expertise. Now people are going to join together. Maybe they find that there's a really good farmland and one family moves on that farmland and maybe another family will come and live on the same farmland, and they're forming communities where they are sharing some of the responsibilities. So as these settlements begin to appear, it's because families are beginning to gather in one place. And where they gather, these Neolithic communities arise. And these new surpluses of crops allow some people who are good at farming to farm, but not everybody has to farm. Now, other people can spend their time doing what they're good at. Maybe you've got some people who are, built like linebackers and they're ready to defend the city. Well, they can train to become better at defending a city. Or maybe there are some people who are craftsmen. They're really good at making pots. They're really good at weaving clothes. People are now going to divide themselves based on their talent and not necessarily on their needs. And this is a process we call specialization, where people begin to do a specialized job. You don't want me farming. I cannot grow crops to save my life. I try every year to grow tomatoes and I kill them every year. Wanted me to teach the young. I can teach the young. So instead of farming, other people in the community might say, look, we'll grow your food if you teach our young. And so a specialized job category arises because not everybody needs to farm in order to survive. So these settlements become very, very important. And in those settlements, there's no money. So if you want some corn, you're going to have to trade or barter in order to get what you need. So I might teach their children, and they might give me corn as a payment. So I'm bartering my services for those goods. Now, specialization happens in a lot of different ways. And some of the areas where Neolithic man seems to begin specializing happens as men and women became artists and priests. These are two roles that we did not see in Paleolithic times. Now, we've already taken a look at some cave paintings, and we've seen that cave paintings are an explosion of art. And with that explosion of art, there's a creation of different tools that are needed in order to create the paintings or the jewelry or the sculptures or the things that they need to express their views about life. This leads also to some advanced spiritual practices. We begin to see emerging people creating rituals for the dead. There's a person who has to talk to God, has to intervene between man and God. There are new burial rituals that we're finding. People are buried for the first part, and then they're buried with animals or with jewelry. So we see the beginnings of art and religion happening as a result of specialization. And then further, we see religion and politics beginning to merge as powerful priests become kings, and they rule because they believe they had a divine right to rule others as granted to them by the gods. The gods said, you're a powerful priest. You get to rule over all of these people because I have granted you favor. So we see all of these areas of specialization, art and religion and government, happening because of the surplus that's created by the domestication that happens during this Neolithic period. So this is all radically changing. We're going from being using crude stone tools to using complex tools. Man's going from hunting and gathering to farming and herding. He's moving from a nomadic lifestyle to one of settling in communities. They're moving from everyone doing the same job to people specializing in a particular job. They're moving from every family member sharing in how to run the family to one ruling family having power over all of the other families. So each of these is a change, but when we combine all of these together, it is a radical lifestyle change. And that's why this period becomes known as the Neolithic Revolution.